Before we begin, I need you to understand one thing. This is not a story about drug use. It is about a plant older than human civilization, how it became the pretext for a war that reshaped entire societies, destroyed millions of lives, and altered the very foundations of global law and order. So if you're here for this journey, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely wish to delve deeper. Tell me in the comments where you're from. What time is it where you are right now? The world is vast, and this story touches every corner of it. Put your phone away, shut out the noise. Now begins. In the beginning, there was only cannabis. Not cannabis, not weed, not cannabis, just cannabis. A tall fiber plant, leaves serrated, capable of growing almost anywhere humans settled. Its origins buried deep in ancient mists, perhaps originating somewhere in Central Asia, possibly present-day Mongolia or the Qing-Inst Tibet plateau. Archaeological evidence suggests the partnership between humans and hemp has endured for at least 10,000 years, if not longer. This was no union born of intoxication, but a necessity of survival. The Neolithic ancestors who bid farewell to nomadic life and became the first cultivators to transform the land, soon discovered this plant was a gift from the heavens. Its fibers rank among nature's most resilient materials. Stripped from the stalk, dried and twisted into rope, can withstand immense loads without snapping, woven into cloth. It offers durability, breathability and resistance to decay. In an era where survival depended on ingenuity and resources demanded utmost utilization, hemp proved indispensable, clothing the body, becoming sails that cut through wind and waves, and forming the very bonds that sustained civilization. By 8000 BC, hemp cultivation had spread across Asia. In ancient China, it was counted among the 5 grains, though strictly speaking it is not a cereal. The Chinese utilized every part of the plant. Seeds were pressed for oil, providing a rich nutritional source. Fibers were fashioned into clothing and paper. Indeed, paper, the oldest surviving paper fragments, date to the 2nd century BC, and were made from hemp fiber. As one of the world's earliest comprehensive medical texts, the Divine Farmer's Classic of Materia Medica listed hemp as a panacea for rheumatism, malaria, and even forgetfulness. The legendary Emperor Shen Nong, father of Chinese agriculture and medicine, is said to have employed it as early as 2737 BC to treat ailments like gout. Whether historical fact or mythical wisdom, this attests to hemp's profound roots in the ancient world. It served not merely as medicine and material, but also became a silent gateway to altered states of consciousness. The ancient Scythians understood this profoundly. These fierce nomadic horsemen once struck terror across the vast steppes from the Black Sea to China's borders. In the 5th century BC, the Greek historian Herodotus, with the precision of an anthropologist, documented their ritualistic cannabis practices. Following funerals, he wrote, the Scythians erect small tents, within which they place heated stones, upon which they scatter hemp seeds. The tent fills with an intense fragrance. The mourners inhaled deeply the smoke, emitting cries of delight. This is a ritual of release and transcendence, a means to touch the spirit world and honor the departed. This is by no means recreational use in the modern sense, but a sacred rite. As trade routes expanded and empires rose and fell, when vast caravans migrated along the Silk Road, cannabis journeyed with them. Upon reaching India, it found its spiritual home. Within Hindu tradition, cannabis is intimately linked to Shiva, the god of destruction and transformation. Legend holds that Shiva himself would partake of bhang, a beverage made by grinding cannabis leaves and mixing them with milk, spices, and honey, said to bring clarity of thought, aid meditation, and open the doors of perception. Bhang is widely consumed during festivals, especially the colorful Holi festival, and remains legal and widely used in India to this day. Cannabis, in the form of bhang, in the forms of ganja and hashish, has woven itself into the religious and cultural fabric of the subcontinent. It is the plant of aesthetics, and the plant of Himalayan yoga seeking enlightenment. From India, cannabis spread to the Middle East and Africa. In the ancient world, cannabis was ubiquitous, a silent companion as the curtain of human civilization slowly rose. But in Western Europe, its story unfolded quite differently. The Greeks and Romans certainly knew of cannabis, using its fibers for ropes and textiles, yet the plant's psychoactive properties and the concept of altering consciousness through inhalation or ingestion did not take root in European culture, at least not then. For them, cannabis was a crop, not a sacred object, a utilitarian substance, not a mystical one. For millennia, this equilibrium persisted. Cannabis existed in dozens of forms, across dozens of cultures, utilized by each people according to their needs and belief. In China, a medicine. In Rome, a rope. In India, a sacred intoxicant. In Scythia, a mourning ritual. It was ubiquitous yet unremarkable, part of the human agricultural landscape. No one feared it. No one demonized it. It was simply an ordinary plant, like countless other plants. It served silently. Then the world changed. The age of exploration dawned. Hemp reached unprecedented practical heights, yet sowed the seeds of future persecution. Those great sailing ships that carried European empires across the oceans to conquer the New World were built from hemp fiber. Every rope, every sail, every piece of rigging and caulking came from it. A single large warship required over 50 tons of hemp rope. Without hemp rope, there would have been no age of exploration, no global empires, no Columbian exchange. Hemp rope held strategic significance. Its importance to national security, rivaling steel and gunpowder. It was truly an indispensable strategic material for the Navy. When European colonizers arrived on the new continent, their foremost task was to cultivate hemp. In 1606, French botanist Louis Harbert established North America's first hemp field in present-day Nova Scotia. 1611, the English followed suit in Virginia. Colonial authorities not only encouraged hemp cultivation, but mandated it as a compulsory industry. Virginia law stipulated that every farmer must grow hemp, with violators facing fines or imprisonment. George Washington cultivated hemp at Mount Vernon. Thomas Jefferson cultivated hemp at Monticello. Benjamin Franklin's paper mill operated using hemp as raw material. The first draft of the Declaration of Independence was written on hemp paper. This was by no means a countercultural crop, but rather an institutionally supported pillar industry, forming the lifeblood of the colonial economy. Hemp was money. Its value was so high that in certain colonies it could even be used to pay taxes. It was literally woven into the fabric of the nascent American Republic. The canvas for wagons pushing west, the hemp rope for laying rail. Levi Strauss crafted the first denim trousers from hemp fiber. Their durability withstood the grueling trials of gold miners. But here the story diverges. A single plant began leading a double life. Industrial hemp, fiber, seed, paper minus making material, are varieties of cannabis sativa cultivated over generation to enhance stem strength and reduce psychoactive components. These plants are tall, rich in fiber, and contain almost no tetrafloconorginable THC, the chemical responsible for cannabis's euphoric effects. Smoking industrial hemp would only induce a splitting headache. Yet, in the warm climates of India, Mexico, the Caribbean and parts of Africa, different varieties persist. Indian cannabis and certain alfalfa strains are cultivated for their inflorescences. These resin-minus rich buds contain THC concentrations far exceeding those of industrial hemp. They are not rope-minus making material, but hallucinogenic drugs. As global trade and population migration accelerated from the 19th to early 20th centuries, The worlds of industrial hemp and psychedelic cannabis began colliding within Western consciousness. This collision initially progressed slowly. During the 1830s and 1840s, European colonial physicians stationed in India began documenting cannabis's medicinal properties. Irish physician William Brooke Pacheco conducted extensive research in Calcutta and published his findings in 1839. He reported that cannabis tincture demonstrated remarkable efficacy in treating muscular spasms, rheumatism, and convulsions. After bringing samples back to Britain, cannabis extract was soon prescribed across Europe and America. By the 1850s, cannabis had been included in the United States Pharmacopoeia, this officially recognized compendium of medicines. The public could freely purchase cannabis tinctures, extracts and pills from pharmacies. Indications ranged from migraines, menstrual cramps to insomnia. Pharmaceutical giants of the era, Parker Davis, Lilly, and Squibb all manufactured cannabis-based medicines. There was neither stigmatization nor moral panic. At the time, it was simply one of many herbal preparations used as a routine medication. But cannabis's entry into Western society did not stop there. In the 1840s, a group of French Romantic writers and artists formed an organization in Paris known as the Club des Hachishins. Members included Charles Baudelaire, Alexandre Dumas, and Victor Hugo. They would gather at a hotel on Ile Saint-Louis to consume thick green cannabis paste mixed with honey and immerse themselves in drug-induced altered states throughout the night. Baudelaire documented these experiences in detail, describing how the drug distorted perceptions of time, amplified sensory experiences, and unlocked creative visions. He also cautioned against its dangers, noting it could lure users into negative dream states, gradually eroding willpower. At this juncture, cannabis represented an exotic intellectual marvel, imbued with bohemian rebelliousness and tinged with Oriental allure. The West was captivated, yet it remained perpetually marginal, a plaything for artists and adventurers. The common populace showed scant interest in consuming hashish. They had tinctures that sufficed until the Great Migration wave swept in, and demonization followed. Late 19th to early 20th century, immigration surged across America. Mexican laborers fled the chaos and violence of the 1910 Mexican Revolution. They brought their language, culture, and customs. Among these was cannabis use, Spanish for marijuana. This practice was particularly prevalent among Mexico's working classes, especially among soldiers and laborers. It served both recreational purposes and medicinal uses. After arduous labor, it offered an inexpensive, readily available form of relaxation. Mexican immigrants settled primarily in the Southwest, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California, engaging in agricultural, railway construction, and mining. The cannabis they introduced almost immediately became a flashpoint for racial and economic anxieties. Here the narrative takes a darker turn. This plant became weaponized within a broader cultural war. The very term itself carries significant weight. Americans had decades of medical cannabis usage, yet marijuana was a foreign word, a Mexican term. Anti-cannabis campaigners deliberately employed this term to render the substance unfamiliar and dangerous, and associated it with immigrant communities, against whom white Americans harbored widespread suspicion and hostility. Local newspapers, particularly those in Texas, began publishing sensationalist accounts of Mexicans committing crimes after consuming cannabis. The drug was blamed for violence, insanity, and moral decay. It became a convenient scapegoat, channeling broad anti-immigrant sentiment into specific legislative targets. 1914 El Paso became one of America's first cities to ban the sale and possession of cannabis. The motive was transparent. The city council sought to control the growing Mexican population, by criminalizing the customary drug, which provided the police with a means to act. This pattern repeated across the Southwest. By the 1920s, over a dozen states enacted anti-marijuana legislation, almost exclusively in regions with significant Mexican immigrant populations. Thus began the drug war, though still confined to the local level and fragmented in nature, closely intertwined with xenophobic sentiment. Meanwhile, another cultural revolution was brewing in the northern urban centers. As part of the Great Migration, African Americans migrating from rural southern states brought jazz culture. In New Orleans, Chicago, Kansas City and Harlem's smoke-filled underground clubs, jazz musicians discovered cannabis enhanced musical expression. It slowed the passage of time, heightened sensory perception, elevating improvisation to transcendent heights. Louis Armstrong used cannabis throughout his life, calling it his regulator, believing it helped him relax and let the music flow naturally. Cab Calloway playfully alluded to the drug in his 19th Tito song The Marijuana Man. Yet what was celebrated within the black jazz community instilled fear in white America. Jazz itself was deemed dangerous, sexually provocative product. Marijuana thus became linked to this threat. It represented black music, black culture, black subversion. This drug was no longer merely a Mexican issue. It had become a black issue. This racial dimension could not be ignored. The core of the anti-marijuana campaign was never public health or pharmacology. It was about control. Its target was groups deemed dangerous, unwelcome or politically inconvenient groups. Drugs were merely the pretext. Suppression was the ultimate objective. Amidst this turbulent landscape emerged a man who would dominate American drug policy for nearly 4 decades. Harry Anslinger. In 1930, Harry Jacob Anslinger was appointed as the inaugural commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, a position he held until 1962. He was a bureaucrat, a moral crusader, and a master propagandist whose career was dedicated to a singular mission, the eradication of cannabis. In his early tenure, Anslinger paid scant attention to cannabis. His focus remained fixed on opiates and cocaine, substances regulated federally since the Harrison Act of 1914. But as the Great Depression deepened, the DI's budget faced cuts. Anslinger urgently required a new holy war to justify the agency's existence. Cannabis, which remained largely unregulated at the federal level at that time, presented a perfect opportunity. Anslinger launched a relentless and duplicitous media campaign. He cultivated relationships with newspaper editors and continuously supplied them with sensational, his ed stories to frighten the public. His propaganda heavily drew upon racist narratives circulating in the southwestern, northern urban area. He claimed cannabis caused violence, psychosis, and sexual deviance. Testifying before Congress, he cited horrifying cases of adult men murdering with axes after smoking cannabis and rape white women. One of his most frequently cited cases was the 1933 Florida incident, where youth victim Carter murdered his family with an axe. Anslinger insisted cannabis was the culprit, despite Carter's documented history of severe mental illness and the complete absence of evidence he had ever consumed cannabis. Truth was irrelevant. The narrative served its purpose. Anslinger's rhetoric was steeped in vicious racism. In private correspondence and public testimony, he spoke of cannabis minus mad Negroes, warning that marijuana would induce white women to engage in sexual relations with blacks and black entertainers. He amassed and disseminated gory archive, sensationalizing reports of cannabis minus related crime. Most were unverified or entirely fabricated. He understood fear, particularly racial fear, as the most potent tool for shaping public opinion. Hollywood eagerly capitalized on this panic by producing exploitation films reinforcing Anslinger's narrative. Most notoriously, 1930's Marijuana Madness, originally titled Tell Your Children, portrayed cannabis as a 1-way ticket to insanity, violence, and death. In the film, while minus-behaved youths were lured into cannabis parties and within minutes descended into hallucinations, frantically playing pianos, laughing hysterically, causing fatal car accidents, ultimately ending in suicide and mental collapse. This absurdly exaggerated propaganda, a film was widely distributed to schools and churches as an educational tool. This propaganda campaign proved effective. By 1937, Anslinger had amassed sufficient political momentum to doctor federal legislation, ultimately culminating in the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937. Strictly speaking, the act did not directly criminalize cannabis, but imposed prohibitively high taxes on those cultivating, prescribing, or selling the substance. It mandated registration, using special order forms and paying fees, making compliance virtually impossible for ordinary citizens, effectively imposing a ban through bureaucratic means. At congressional hearings, Dr. William Woodward, representing the American Medical Association, testified against the bill. He argued cannabis had legitimate medical uses, lacked scientific evidence supporting Anslinger's claims of violence and insanity, and exposed the term cannabis as deliberately misleading, masking the medicinal plant nature of what physicians had prescribed for decades. His testimony was disregarded. Industrial hemp growers also protested, arguing cannabis cultivation was vital for rope, textile and paper industries. Yet firms like DuPont were developing synthetic fibers like nylon. Wood pulp had become the primary paper raw material. Some historians contend, though controversially, that corporate interests in these industries covertly backed prohibition to eliminate competition. Whether conspiracy or coincidence, the outcome was identical. Despite its industrial value, hemp was swept into the vortex of cannabis prohibition. The Cannabis Act passed with minimal opposition. Few members of Congress understood what they were voting on. Fewer still cared about the substance. The bill was packaged as legislation to control dangerous drugs used by Mexicans and black people. That sufficed. Thus this plant, cultivated by humankind for millennia, which once clothed armies, nourished the populace, and healed the sick, became an illicit substance almost overnight. The war was declared, the enemy named. For 80 years thereafter, this conflict escalated, spread, engulfing society. Yet this plant proved tenacious and resilient, refusing to vanish. World War I forced a temporary truce in this cannabis conflict when Japan invaded the Philippines, severing the U.S. military supply of Manila hemp, a distinct plant despite the similar name. The American forces faced crisis. Hemp rope, rigging, and parachute webbing all required this material. The war effort hung in the balance. The government then reversed policy with astonishing cognitive dissonance. 1940, the U.S. Department of Agriculture launched the Victory Hemp Campaign, producing propaganda films urging farmers to regard hemp cultivation as a patriotic duty. Those who grew hemp were exempt from military service. Cultivation in the Midwest exceeded 400,000 acres. A plant demonized just 5 years prior suddenly became a hero. But the moment the war ended, so did the tolerance. Hemp fields were plowed under and destroyed. The program vanished entirely. For decades, the government even denied the existence of the Victory hemp films. Only when surviving copies were discovered in the Library of Congress and National Archives was the cannabis ban reinstated, as if it had never been lifted. In the post-war years, cannabis remained a marginal presence in mainstream American society. It was associated only with jazz musicians, Mexican laborers, and the bohemian fringes of culture. The beat generation of the 1952s, Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, William Burroughs, embraced it as a creed of resistance against mainstream society, yet they remained cultural mavericks, with limited influence, until the 1960s, when everything abruptly changed. This countercultural explosion bore multiple characteristics: youth rebellion, sexual liberation, anti-authoritarian struggle. Yet it was undeniably a symbol of drug culture. Cannabis spread from jazz clubs and beat poetry readings to university campuses, permeated suburban bedrooms, ultimately engulfing the entire United States. Youth rebellion, sexual liberation, anti-authoritarianism. Yet it was undeniably a symbol of drug culture. Cannabis became its spiritual totem, spreading from jazz clubs and beat poetry readings to university campuses, permeating suburban bedrooms, ultimately engulfing an entire generation who questioned every notion instilled by their parents. Cannabis became a symbol, its consumption signifying open defiance against the Vietnam War, against racism, against the suffocating conformity of 1952's American culture. It was a political manifesto wrapped in rolling papers. Hippies on San Francisco's Ashbury Street, protesters at Kent State University, the Woodstock Festival's teeming crowds, united by music, idealism and cannabis. Establishment figures were horrified. Cannabis was once again associated with groups threatening social order. This time not Mexicans or black jazz musicians, but white middle-class children, the offspring of respectable families choosing to drop out, immerse themselves, light up. Parents were in a panic. Politicians sensed an opportunity. Richard Nixon, running for president in 1968, made law and order the cornerstone of his campaign. For him and his advisors, the counterculture was not merely a cultural movement, but a political enemy. This infamous statement, revealed by Nixon's domestic policy advisor John Eric Mann in a 1994 interview, laid bare. In 1968, Nixon's campaign team and subsequent White House administration had two primary adversaries: the anti-war left and African Americans. We knew we couldn't criminalize opposition to the war or black identity, but by linking hippies with marijuana and African Americans with heroin, then imposing harsh criminal penalties on both, we could dismantle these groups. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, disrupt their gatherings, and demonize them night after night on the evening news. Were we aware we were lying about drugs? Absolutely. This is no conspiracy theory, but a documented strategy. The war on drugs, initiated by Nixon and perpetuated by successive administration, never centered on drugs themselves. It was about control, about suppressing dissent, about targeting groups challenging the political status quo. 1970 Nixon signed the Controlled Substances Act, classifying drugs into 5 schedules based on medical value and abuse potential. Cannabis was placed in Schedule I, the most restrictive category, defined as having no accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse. It was categorized alongside heroin and LSD, while cocaine and methamphetamine were placed in Schedule II. This classification lacked any scientific basis. The Schaefer Commission, personally appointed by Nixon, spent 2 years studying cannabis. In 1972, it concluded that cannabis should be decriminalized. Nixon disregarded the report and shelved it. The law enforcement apparatus rapidly expanded. In 1973, the Drug Enforcement Administration was established to consolidate federal drug enforcement powers. State and local police forces received federal funding and military-grade equipment to wage the war on drugs. Mandatory minimum sentencing stripped judges of their discretion, resulting in years of imprisonment for minor cannabis offenses. Subsequently, millions were arrested. The figures are staggering. Between 1965 and 2020, over 26 million Americans were arrested on cannabis charges. 20-6 million. This figure exceeds Australia's entire population. Approximately 88% of those arrested were detained solely for possession, not trafficking. Most were users, often young people, often arrested for possessing small quantities for personal use. Racial disparities are equally stark, despite similar usage rates across ethnic groups. Studies consistently show white and black cannabis usage rates are broadly comparable. Yet black individuals are nearly 4 times more likely than whites to be arrested for cannabis possession. In certain states, this disparity is even more pronounced. In Montana, black cannabis arrest rates are nearly 10 times higher than those for whites, despite black residents comprising less than 1% of the state's population. This is no coincidence, but a consequence of policy. The war on drugs has provided law enforcement with tools and justifications, enabling high-pressure policing of minority communities, stop-and search policies, broken windows policing, no-knock search warrants, all legitimate under the banner of drug interdiction. Cannabis has become the most readily available trophy, the simplest basis for charges. It also serves as the most expedient conduit for feeding inmates into the ever-expanding prison-industrial complex. For this is precisely the emerging industry. Private prisons emerged in the 1980s. These corporations profit by contracting with state governments to incarcerate prisoners. Their business model relies on high incarceration rates. Marijuana arrests provide a steady stream of inventory. The consequences for those arrested are catastrophic and lifelong, even for minor cannabis possession. Conviction means imprisonment, but the punishment extends far beyond. It means a permanent criminal record appearing on every job application, every housing application, every background check. It means losing eligibility for federal student loans, public housing, food stamps. It means professional licenses being revoked, loss of voting rights in many states, the loss of parental rights, and entering custody battles. A single joint can shatter an entire life. Families are torn apart. Communities are hollowed out. During the peak of the cocaine epidemic in the 1980s and 1990s, when mass incarceration reached its zenith, an entire generation of black and Latino men were thrust into the criminal justice system. The social fabric of communities was ripped apart. Children grew up in fatherless households. The stigma of incarceration fueled decades, long cycles of poverty and crime. Meanwhile, cannabis use continued to rise. This represents the fundamental failure of prohibition. Prohibition does not work. It never has. The 1920s prohibition did not stop people drinking. Instead, it spawned a vast black market, nurtured organized crime, and led to thousands dying from adulterated moonshine. Cannabis prohibition repeats this history. By the 1970s and 80s, cannabis cultivation had become a significant American industry. Domestic growers, particularly in California's Emerald Triangle, Humboldt County, Mendocino County and Trinity County, produced high-quality cannabis capable of competing with imports from Mexico and Colombia. Remote, densely forested mountain regions provided ideal cover. Growers carved out concealed plots deep within national forests, far from roads and prying eyes. The government responded with force. In 1983, California launched Operation Clean Sweep. Helicopter raids became routine. Heavily armed officers frequently stormed rural plots without warrants, seizing plants and arresting growers. These paramilitary operations, equipped with automatic weapons, body armor and night vision equipment, yet failed to stem the tide of cultivation. For every plot destroyed, tenfold new fields emerged the following season. The economic law proved overwhelming, with mature cannabis plants fetching $1 to $3 on the black market for struggling rural communities and those unemployed by the timber industry's collapse. Cannabis cultivation became the sole livelihood. The irony is bitterly poignant. The very prohibition intended to eradicate cannabis has instead created the perfect breeding ground for its rampant proliferation. In the absence of legal regulation, there exists no quality control, no age restrictions, and no tax collection. The entire market is controlled by criminal syndicates. These criminals have become fabulously wealthy. In Mexico, cannabis cultivation once paled in comparison to poppy cultivation and cocaine-transit operations. Yet in the 1980s, as Colombian drug cartels shifted focus to cocaine, and US pressure forced Mexico to eradicate poppy fields, marijuana cultivation exploded. Sinaloa, El Golfo, Juarez and other cartels established vast plantations across the Sierra Madre Mountains. These were no small minor-scale jungle operation, but industrial minor-scale enterprises, with thousands of cannabis plants blanketing hillsides, irrigated and tended by armed herdsmen. Drawing on lessons from the cocaine trade, cartels recognized vertical integration as the key to maximizing profits. They controlled the entire supply chain, from cultivation to smuggling and distribution in US cities. The violent patterns of the former cocaine wars spread to the cannabis trade. Rival cartels unleashed bloody conflicts over smuggling routes. Farmers who refused to cultivate cannabis or attempted to switch allegiances were brutally silenced. Local police officers and officials were either bribed or assassinated. By the 2002s, vast swaths of Mexico descended into lawlessness. Armed drug lord factions, whose firepower overwhelmed the state, operated with impunity. This humanitarian catastrophe has wrought devastating consequences. Between 2006 and 2020, Mexico's drug war claimed over 300 lives, with tens of thousands more reported missing. Bodies were either buried in mass graves or dissolved in acid. Journalists investigating drug cartels were brutally murdered. Politicians opposing the cartels were gunned down in broad daylight. The wave of violence spilled across borders. Drug cartels established distribution networks in major US cities. Yet the root cause of this violence, this death and suffering, was a plant that half of America's states would eventually legalize. For while the drug war raged, a remarkable transformation unfolded at grassroots level. People began to resist. The counterculture never truly died. It merely went underground. Throughout the 70s, 80s, 90s, activists persistently worked to reshape public discourse on cannabis. Organizations like NORML, National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws, actively pushed for decriminalization. High Times magazine, founded in 1974, championed cannabis culture, providing a platform for the legalization argument. The scientific community likewise challenged propaganda and narrative. Research into the endocannabinoid system, the network of receptors in the human body that interact with cannabis compounds, revealed cannabis poses significantly lower risks than alcohol and tobacco. Studies confirmed cannabis is not a gateway drug, does not incite violent behavior, and holds legitimate medical value in treating chronic pain, epilepsy, and chemotherapy side effects. Yet the true breakthrough did not originate from scientists or activists, but from patient communities. In the 1980s, as the AIDS epidemic ravaged gay communities, particularly in San Francisco, patients discovered cannabis alleviated suffering. It stimulated appetite, and those emaciated by disease mitigated severe nausea induced by early AIDS medications, relieved chronic neuropathic pain for many. It meant being able to eat, live normally, maintain basic quality of life, rather than endure suffering. It alleviated the severe nausea induced by early HIV medications, and eased the chronic pain of neuropathy. For many patients, this represented a turning point, from being unable to eat, losing the ability to function, and forfeiting quality of life, to sustaining basic survival. Activist Dennis Barron, himself HIV-positive, founded the San Francisco Marijuana Purchasers Club in 1992. This became America's first openly operating dispensary. Despite its operations being illegal at the time, Perrin and his partner provided cannabis to AIDS patients. Local authorities, recognizing its humanitarian value, largely turned a blind eye. This became the seed of the medical cannabis movement. Plant drafted the Compassionate Use Act Proposition 215 and placed it on the California ballot in 1996. The bill permitted patients with doctors' recommendations to legally use medical cannabis, directly challenging federal prohibition. Authorities mounted a fierce counterattack. The Drug Enforcement Administration threatened to arrest doctors prescribing cannabis. The Clinton administration warned federal lawsuit preceded state legislation. Opponents ran advertisements claiming Proposition 215 was a backdoor to cannabis legalization that would lead to cannabis shops on every street corner. The latter part of this prophecy ultimately came to pass. On election night in November 1996, Proposition 215 passed with 56% of the vote, making California the first state to legalize medical cannabis. The floodgates had opened within a few short years. Oregon, Washington, Alaska, Maine and other states followed suit. By 2010, 15 states had enacted medical cannabis regulations. By 2020, this figure had risen to 30-6 states plus the District of Columbia, even operating in a legal gray area, where state law permits but federal law prohibits. The medical cannabis industry generated billions in revenue. Yet despite its therapeutic value, medical cannabis was clearly merely a stepping stone. California's dispensary system soon became a front for recreational users to obtain cannabis. Obtaining a medical recommendation was remarkably straightforward. Walk into a clinic. After a 5-minute consultation, one could secure the true, decisive battle. The ultimate objective was full legalization. This campaign commenced in 2012 in Colorado and Washington state. The legalization campaigns in both states were meticulously planned, with substantial funding and strategic finesse. Activists had learned from decades of failure that appeals to individual liberty or countercultural rebellion alone would not prevail. A pragmatic argument was essential. Their message was concise and powerful. Prohibition has failed, costing billions of dollars, ruining millions of lives, yet failing to deter anyone from using cannabis. Legalization means regulation. Taxation and oversight means reclaiming the market from drug cartels, placing it in the hands of licensed, regulated businesses. Means ending arrests and incarceration for non-violent users. Means treating cannabis like alcohol, legal adult use, safety oversight, taxes benefiting public welfare. 6 November 2012. Voters in Colorado and Washington state passed referendums approving the legalization of recreational cannabis for adults aged 21 and over. This marks a historic moment. As the world's first jurisdictions to achieve full cannabis legalization through democratic vote, the federal government's response remains uncertain. Technically speaking, cannabis remains illegal under federal law, classified as a schedule, a controlled substance, with no recognized medical use. The Drug Enforcement Administration could have cracked down on cannabis shops, arresting growers and sellers, but the Obama administration, sensing the political winds, chose a different path. In 2013, the Department of Justice issued the Cole Memorandum, effectively stating that as long as states maintain strict oversight, preventing cannabis from flowing across state lines or into the hands of minors, the federal government would not interfere with state-level legalization processes. This move opened the floodgates. In 2014, Alaska and Oregon achieved legalization. In 2016, California, Nevada, Maine and Massachusetts followed suit. In 2018, Canada achieved nationwide legalization, becoming the first major industrialized nation to do so. By 2025, over half of U.S. states had legalized recreational cannabis. 2-3 of states have legalized medical use. The legal cannabis industry rapidly expanded into a multi-billion dollar sector. Pharmacies, cultivation facilities, processing laboratories, food manufacturers, vaping companies, testing laboratories, security firms, software companies, packaging suppliers, an entire industrial ecosystem emerged. In 2020, US legal cannabis sales exceeded $17 billion. By 2023, this had surged to over $30 billion. Wall Street took notice. Listed cannabis enterprises landed on major stock exchanges. Venture capital poured in. Celebrities launched their own brands. Snoop Dogg, Willie Nelson, Mike Tyson, Whoopi Goldberg all became cannabis entrepreneurs. This plant demonized for a century is now embraced by capitalism. Yet despite its promising outlook, legalization brings its own complexities, contradictions and failures. The foremost issue remains the uncertainty of federal law. Under federal statutes, cannabis remains illegal, classified as a Schedule I substance, deemed to have no medical use, despite substantial scientific evidence to the contrary, and despite legal markets existing in over half the country, creating a surreal legal environment. Even in states where it is fully legal, cannabis businesses cannot access the federal banking system. Banks, fearing federal prosecution or loss of Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation (FDIC) coverage, refuse to engage with cannabis enterprises. Consequently, the industry operates primarily on cash. Cannabis dispensaries handle thousands, even millions, in cash monthly. They must pay taxes in cash, settle employee wages, and settle supplier invoices. This makes them prime targets for robbery, and presents significant logistical and accounting challenges. Meanwhile, the U.S. Internal Revenue Service penalizes cannabis businesses under Section 280E of the Internal Revenue Code, which prohibits businesses dealing in controlled substances from deducting ordinary business expenses. Ordinary businesses may deduct rent, salaries, utilities and operating costs. Cannabis businesses cannot. They may only deduct the cost of goods sold. This translates to effective tax rates as high as 70% or more. Such crushing taxation renders profitability nearly impossible for many operators. This contradiction is utterly absurd. States are collecting billions in cannabis taxes. Colorado alone has levied over $2 billion into legalization. Yet the federal government simultaneously punishes these businesses through predatory taxation and denial of banking services. The second issue is fairness, or rather, the absence thereof. The overwhelming majority of those profiting from the legal cannabis industry are white. The vast majority profiting from the legal cannabis industry are white individuals, while those incarcerated for cannabis offenses are predominantly black and brown people. This irony is both bitter and predictable. The war on drugs devastated minority communities, and now these same communities are excluded from the legal industry, built upon their suffering. Access to the legal cannabis market is extremely high. Licenses are scarce and prohibitively expensive. Application fees alone can run into hundreds of thousands of dollars, with no guarantee of approval. Compliance costs are staggering. Security systems, testing requirements, packaging and labeling standards, inventory tracking software. Launching a legal cannabis enterprise demands millions in capital. But where does this funding come from? Banks shun the industry. Traditional investors remain wary of its federal illegality. One requires private wealth, personal connections, or venture capital channels. Yet these very resources are typically absent in communities devastated by the war on drugs. Some states attempt to address this through social equity programs, offering priority licensing or reduced fees to applicants from communities disproportionately impacted by cannabis prohibition. But these schemes are fraught with problems: underfunding, bureaucratic delays, difficulties accessing capital, even after securing a license, and, in some instances, outright fraud. Affluent applicants exploit minority partners as fronts to gain social equity, eligibility, before subsequently buying them out. Meanwhile, the criminal justice system continues operating under outdated rules. In states where cannabis is legal, thousands remain incarcerated for acts that are no longer crimes, though some states implement automatic expungement of cannabis convictions. The process is often slow, incomplete, or requires individuals to navigate complex legal systems themselves to clear their records. Many convicted decades ago remain unaware of their eligibility for relief. In states where cannabis remains illegal, primarily concentrated in the South and Inland West, arrests persist. During the height of the pandemic in 2020, over 350 Zorro Americans were arrested on cannabis-related charges, equating to one arrest every 90 seconds. The vast majority for simple possession. For millions of Americans, the war on drugs is not history, but an ongoing reality. The third issue concerns public health, particularly among adolescents. Proponents of cannabis legalization have promised that regulatory frameworks would prevent minors from accessing cannabis more effectively than prohibition. Yet the evidence remains divided. Some studies indicate no rise in adolescent use post-minus legalization. Others show a slight increase. But the potency of modern cannabis has undeniably increased exponentially. In the 1970s, cannabis averaged just a 3% tetrafocanoidinable THC content. Today, that figure has soared to 25-30%. Powdered cannabis with 25-30% THC is now commonplace. Concentrates, oils, waxes, shafters and similar products can exceed 90% THC. This is not the cannabis of your grandparents' era, but an entirely distinct new product, whose health impacts remain under investigation. Growing evidence suggests a link between high-potency cannabis use and mental health issues, particularly pronounced among adolescents and young adults. Long-term use of high-THC products has been shown to increase psychotic episodes and schizophrenia incidents in susceptible individuals, while inducing cannabis-induced nausea and vomiting syndrome characterized by severe cyclical vomiting. Heavy users may develop dependence, though distinct from the physical withdrawal symptoms associated with opioid addiction. It fosters psychological dependence that disrupts daily functioning. Industry marketing strategies further exacerbate this trend. Step into a modern cannabis dispensary, and you'll find confectionery, cookies, gummy bears, chocolate bars and other visually appealing products, all containing high doses of tetrafocanoidinable. Packaging design oft undeliberately targets younger consumers. Edible products present particular challenges due to delayed and unpredictable effects. Inexperienced users may consume an entire cookie with no reaction, then take a second, resulting in an intense beta- or hallucinogenic state. In legalized regions, emergency room visits related to cannabis continue to rise, with overdose from edibles and accidental ingestion of candy like THC products by children being the most prominent issue. These issues are solvable. Improve packaging, provide cleared dosage guidance, enhance public education. Yet the industry has been slow to respond, because profit takes precedence over public health. The fourth issue is industry consolidation and corporatization. Many advocates envisioned legalization, fostering a cottage industry of small-scale growers and artisanal producers, cultivating a cannabis culture prioritizing quality and craftsmanship. The reality, however, is escalating corporate oligopoly. Large-scale, multi-state operators such as Curleaf, TLU Leaf, Green Thumb Industries are acquiring licenses, constructing vast cultivation facilities, and driving smaller operators out of the market due to inability to compete on price or scale. Vertical integration models, where a single enterprise controls the entire chain from cultivation to processing and retail, are becoming the industry norm. These giants are racing to secure market dominance ahead of federal legalization, aiming to become the new Budweiser or Philip Morris International of cannabis. When federal legalization inevitably arrives, most analysts believe it is merely a matter of time. These large enterprises will leverage their substantial capital, specialist legal teams, lobbying power and political connections to dominate the formulation of regulations favorable to themselves. The small farmers in Hancock County who have devoted decades to preserving cannabis culture will ultimately be crushed by industrialized agriculture. If the artisanal cannabis movement survives at all, it will be relegated to product. This is the harsh reality behind legalization. It is neither a victory for counterculture, nor a triumph of justice, but rather the complete commodification and corporatization of what was once a symbol of rebellion. This plant is being domesticated, stripped of its revolutionary significance, reduced to an ordinary consumer product like beer or cigarettes. Yet despite its many flaws, legalization remains preferable to prohibition, for prohibition has never merely failed. It has been an act of violence. Let us see the true outcomes of this cannabis war. It has not reduced usage rates. It has not safeguarded public health. It has not enhanced community safety. What it has done is destroy lives on an industrial scale. It has filled prisons to overflowing. The United States holds just 4% of the world's population, yet imprisons 20% of the world's prisoners, both in absolute numbers and per capita. We incarcerate more people than any nation in history, and drug offenses are the primary driver of this mass incarceration. Drug offenses, led by cannabis, have cost taxpayers trillions of dollars for cannabis enforcement alone. The direct costs of arrests, prosecutions, and incarceration exceed $3.6 billion annually. Yet this excludes indirect costs, lost productivity from incarcerated individuals, tax revenue forgone, foster care expenses for children of imprisoned parents, and the long-term economic impact on communities. The true cost is incalculable. Prohibition enriches criminal organizations by maintaining cannabis's illegal status. All profits inevitably flow into the black market. Before states began legalization, Mexican drug cartels were already earning billions from cannabis. These profits fund cocaine and heroin trafficking, weapons purchases, and the bribery of officials. Prohibition is the drug cartel's greatest accomplice. It also distorts the law enforcement system, driven by federal funding and asset forfeiture laws. Police seize and retain property linked to drug offenses, shifting enforcement focus towards low-effort cannabis arrests rather than serious crime. This distorted incentive structure leads officers to boost arrests, statistics, and departmental budgets by stopping young black men on the streets, rather than investigating burglaries or assault cases. The war on drugs violates fundamental human rights, serving as justification for no-knock raids, resulting in the loss of innocent lives. It has been employed to justify the militarization of police forces. It has been used to defend searches and seizures violating the Fourth Amendment. It grants the state immense power to intrude upon private lives, break down doors, and tear families apart, all under the pretext of preventing people from possessing a particular plant. Most egregiously, this war is built upon lies. The claim that cannabis incites violence is a complete fabrication. The claim that cannabis is a gateway to hard drugs is a lie lacking causal evidence. The assertion that cannabis has no medical value is a lie. The notion that drug prohibition concerns public health is the most appalling lie of all. Harry Anslinger knew this full well. Richard Nixon knew full well. Subsequent administrations knew full well. This war on drugs was never about drugs themselves. It was about power, control, suppressing dissent and targeting minority communities. In this sense, it succeeded. It achieved its true objectives. It dismantled the anti-war movement. It devastated Black and Latino communities. It created a permanent underclass. Those bearing criminal records are deprived of the right to vote, the right to employment, the right to housing and opportunities for advancement, serving to perpetuate the social hierarchy desired by those in power. Yet lies cannot endure forever. Too many have consumed cannabis and discovered it is not the mythical devil's drug. Too many have witnessed friends, relatives, children, neighbors arrested for seemingly harmless acts. Too many have seen through the hypocrisy of cannabis prohibition. Alcohol and tobacco, which claim hundreds of thousands of lives annually, are not only legal, but held up as paragons of virtue. Truth will ultimately triumph through prolonged suffering. The current landscape is fractured and fraught with contradictions, yet rapidly evolving. In certain regions of the United States, people may enter gleaming dispensaries, browse hundreds of products, consult cannabis advisors on strains and effects, and legally purchase cannabis with credit cards. In other areas, possession of the same plant still risks arrest, prosecution and imprisonment. Internationally, the wave of legalization is accelerating. Uruguay legalized in 2013. Canada followed suit in 2018. Mexico's Supreme Court ruled prohibition unconstitutional. Yet the legislature has delayed establishing a regulatory framework. Germany is moving towards legalization. Thailand decriminalized in 2022. As billions in tax revenue flow to pioneers, even conservative regions are evaluating policies. The United Nations, an institution that for decades supported global prohibition through treaties like the 1960 One Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs, has also begun softening its stance. In 2020, the UN Commission on Narcotic Drugs voted to remove cannabis from the strictest control category, acknowledging its medical value. The momentum for change is evident. Within a single generation, cannabis prohibition will likely be viewed much as we regard prohibition, a disastrous policy failure driven by moral panic and pseudoscience, a dark chapter in the history of social control. Yet the shadow cast by prohibition will endure for generations. Criminal records for millions, communities fractured by mass incarceration, trust shattered between law enforcement and minority communities, lives destroyed, families broken, potential squandered. Legalization alone cannot undo this harm. True justice demands not merely legalization, but reparations. This means expunging all cannabis convictions and releasing prisoners still serving sentences for cannabis offenses. It means compensating individuals for years lost to incarceration. It means investing in communities targeted by prohibition to rebuild what was destroyed. It means dismantling the architecture of the drug war, militarized policing, asset forfeiture laws, mandatory minimum sentences. Some of these reforms are slowly advancing, but they are far from complete. Others remain entirely stagnant. The cannabis industry is rising from the ruins of the war on drugs, yet those profiting from legalization are often not the victims of prohibition. This injustice lies at the heart of the legalization movement's contradiction. With every dispensary opening, every stock rising, every white entrepreneur becoming a millionaire by selling the same plant, it is this very plant that has sent black men to spend decades behind bars. This unpaid moral debt grows heavier by the day. So what is cannabis's true nature? When we strip away a century of propaganda, decades of prohibition and the fog of contemporary commercial marketing, it remains simply a plant, an extraordinary crop whose connection to humanity stretches back to the earliest agricultural civilizations. It has nourished us, adorned us, healed us, altered our consciousness, ignited our creativity. It is both sacred and profane, medicine and poison, restraint and rebellion. It is far from harmless. Any psychoactive substance carries abuse potential. It may exacerbate mental health issues in vulnerable individuals, impair judgment and coordination. Adolescents, whose brains are still developing, should avoid it entirely. Their brains are exceptionally sensitive to cannabis's effects. Cannabis must be regulated and controlled. Its use should be grounded in scientific evidence, not marketing hype. Yet, it is not the demonized fiend the world portrays. It does not incite violence, nor is it an inevitable gateway to harder drugs. For many, it alleviates pain, anxiety, insomnia and severe side effects for others. It serves merely as a mild intoxicant, offering relaxation akin to sipping a glass of wine. The essence of the cannabis issue has never resided in the plant itself. The core question is who are the users, who controls it, who profits from it. When the Navy used it to make rope, it was highly esteemed. When Mexicans smoked it, it was demonized. A plant found in every chemist's shop in 1900 was criminalized when black jazz musicians embraced it. A plant that once sent people to prison for decades is now enriching investors. This is not about pharmacology, but a contest for power. The tale of cannabis ultimately mirrors how society decides what is acceptable and what is taboo. These decisions are not grounded in evidence or reason, but shaped by fear, prejudice, and political expediency. It bears witness to how prohibition is aimed against the vulnerable, and how moral panic overrides science and common sense. It also demonstrates, when enough people rise up in defiance, when enough voices expose the truth, even entrenched injustice will crumble. Yet the journey is far from over. Prisoners still languish behind bars. Arrests occurred daily. The scars of prohibition still ripple through communities. Opponents of legalization and those profiting from prohibition continue to spread falsehoods. The truth about cannabis, that complex, subtle, evidence-based truth, still struggles to be heard amidst the clamor of propaganda and marketing. A plant once demonized as being purified, transformed into a consumer product stripped of its historical and political significance. Companies entering the cannabis sector seek customers, not activists. They wish to peddle a lifestyle, not remind you of the millions suffering under prohibition. They wish for you to regard cannabis as an ordinary commodity, akin to craft beer or artisan chocolate, consumed without thought. But we must not forget, we must not allow cannabis legalization to erase the cost of prohibition, the memory of those harmed and the true reasons behind its enforcement. We must not permit the profits of legalization to overlook their debt to those convicted for actions now lawful. This plant will grow. It always has. Through prohibition and persecution. Through propaganda and prejudice. In a century-long war, cannabis persists. It grows in hidden valleys and vast warehouses. In backyard gardens and pharmaceutical labs. It adapts. It evolves. It spreads. Yet the question remains, can our society learn from history? Can we acknowledge the harm wrought in the name of prohibition? Can we establish a truly just legal framework, centered on fairness and restoration rather than mere profit-seeking? Can we resist corporate control over a plant that belongs to all humanity? Or shall we choose to forget the past and repeat the cycle of control and exploitation in new guises? The sun sinks below the horizon. The Andes soar into the clouds. 10,000 years ago, it was here that cannabis seeds first took root, initiating a transcontinental relationship spanning millennia. Today, this plant still thrives here, spreading far and wide. Amidst Morocco's mountain ranges, farmers cultivate cannabis resin following ancestral traditions across Kentucky's fields. Industrial hemp is experiencing a renaissance in Colorado's suburbs. It grows legally under basement LED lights within Mexico's jungles. Drug cartels still cultivate by the ton, for not all regions have legalized it. The black market remains rampant. The plant never judges. It bears no burden of propaganda, nor carries the shackles of history. It simply grows, nurturing flowers, seeds, and resin, then withers like all things, replaced by a new generation. But we carry a heavy weight. We bear the historical crimes committed in the name of controlling this plant. Millions arrested, billions squandered, countless lies propagated, countless lives destroyed, countless communities shattered. This history is not an abstraction. It lives in those still imprisoned, in communities still recovering from the drug war, in families torn apart by the consequences of conviction. We bear responsibility for the future, how to regulate, how to distribute profits and opportunities, whether to pursue justice rather than commerce, whether we remember history or consign it to oblivion. The story of cannabis is not yet concluded. We are writing its new chapter, with every new law passed, every dispensary opened, every prisoner released or kept incarcerated. History is being written in real time. The outcome remains undecided. It hinges entirely on our present choices. Will we choose justice or convenience? Will we heal wounds or profit from them? Will we remember the cost, or allow cannabis legalization to erase the memories of prohibition's victims? These are not rhetorical questions. They are pressing realities, urgent moral inquiries demanding answers. The solutions lie not in an abstract future, but in the present, as we navigate this historic transition from prohibition to legalization. These questions must be addressed. Regardless, this plant shall endure, having weathered 10 millennia of human civilization. It shall withstand all future trials. The question is not whether cannabis survives, but what we ourselves become. What kind of society do we aspire to be? Can we face history with honesty, acknowledge our mistakes and build a better future? Can we learn from a century of cruelty disguised as policy? Or shall we launch a new holy war, manufacturing fresh moral panics, seeking new pretexts to control society's most vulnerable group? The plant remains merely a plant. This war has always been about humanity itself. Even as headlines clamor, even as laws relax, even as pharmacies proliferate, tax scuffles swell, and stock valuations soar, the war is far from over. It has merely entered a new phase. The battlefield has shifted from streets to courtrooms, from prisons to state legislatures, from debates over legality to contests over who profits. This is not a story with a happy ending. There is no ultimate victory, no moment to declare triumph and retire. The tale of cannabis is humanity's endless struggle with desire, with control, with mind-minus altering substances, and with the power structures that dictate which alterations are permitted. This is the saga of a plant, once revered as sacred, then utilitarian, then demonized, then criminalized, then medicalized, now commercialized. It was rope and creed both panacea, and plagued both countercultural emblem and commodity symbol. This tale began in antiquity, and stretches into an unknown future, written in hemp, vibrant prison records, engraved in pharmacopoeia, Hessian arrest statistics, circulating between ancient rituals and corporate boardrooms. This is a narrative of blood and profit, lies and liberation, suffering and resilience. This is the story of how an ordinary plant became the world's most wanted drug, and the contest is far from over. As I write this in late 2025, cannabis occupies a peculiar grace owned in American society. Its legal status has reached its highest point in a century. Yet in some states, more people remain incarcerated for cannabis offenses than for all violent crimes combined. It has evolved into a multi-billion-dollar industry. Yet businesses remained denied basic banking services. Though recognized as a medicinal drug by most states, it is still deemed medically worthless by the federal government. This contradiction cannot persist forever. A breakthrough will inevitably come. Within the next few years, the federal government is highly likely to reclassify cannabis, opening doors for interstate trade, banking services, and normal commercial operations. This will be hailed as a victory, a milestone marking progress and the end of prohibition. Yet this is not the end, but the beginning of a new chapter, a fresh page in cannabis's long history. The core question defining this new chapter is not whether cannabis is legal, but what kind of legal market we will build, and who will benefit from it. Will it be a market prioritizing fairness, supporting communities harmed by prohibition, a market that paves the way for small operators and artisanal producers, or one dominated by a handful of giant corporations, concentrating wealth in the hands of vested interests, while leaving others behind? Will we expunge the criminal records of all those convicted of cannabis offenses, not just in states where it is legalized, but across the entire nation? Will we release all prisoners incarcerated for offenses that are now decriminalized? Will we compensate them for their stolen years? Will we reinvest the billions in tax revenue generated by legal cannabis into communities devastated by the war on drugs? Will we fund education, treatment, economic development, and restorative work? Will we hold accountable those who designed and enforced drug policies? Figures like Harry Anslinger and Richard Nixon, who deliberately pursued racist agendas under the guise of public health. Will we confront the historical truth and its motivations, or merely wrap things up hastily, declare victory, and leave the outcome to the free market, which inevitably means capital wins, and the capital minus less lose? These questions remain unresolved. The political will to address them remains weak. Established interest groups, corporations vying to monopolize the legal market, law enforcement agencies whose budgets depend on anti-minus drug funding, and politicians who built their careers on tough anti-minus crime rhetoric, all lack the drive to advance genuine restorative justice. Thus the burden falls upon us, activists, advocates, voters, consumers. We have the power to support fair enterprises, demand better policies. To those who refuse to forget the atrocities committed in the name of prohibition, to those who believe legalization is not merely a new opportunity for profit, whether we participate or not, this plant will grow, as it always has. But justice does not sprout on its own. It requires cultivation, nurturing, and struggle. The story of cannabis is not yet finished. We are writing it now, and the length of the next chapter depends entirely on whether we have the courage to confront history, the wisdom to learn from our failures, the resolve to create a better future. A plant is merely a plant. The true question remains, what kind of people will we choose to become?